The night was calm, the kind of silence that you only find deep in the countryside, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of night birds. I sat on the porch of my cabin with Duke, my German shepherd, stretched out at my feet. For most people, this might have been just another quiet evening, but for me, it was sacred. After 20 years of service in the Army, 20 years of sandstorms, firefights, sleepless nights, and brothers in arms lost to battles that never made the news, this land was more than property. It was my sanctuary, the only place where I felt I could breathe freely without the constant weight of the world pressing down on my chest. I had saved for years to buy this place, 30 acres of open field that rolled into thick forest, tucked away at the edge of town where the HOA didn't reach. Or so I thought. When I first signed the deed, I remember standing in the middle of the field, Duke barking happily and thinking, this is it. This is where I'll finally find peace. No commanding officers, no gunfire, just earth beneath my boots and sky above my head. But peace is fragile, and where there are people who hunger for control, peace becomes a target. That's how it started with the HOA. Letters in the mailbox, neat and formal, but carrying threats in every line. At first, it was about my flagpole, the American flag I had raised in front of my cabin. Violation of community standards, the letter read. I laughed when I read it. My land wasn't even under their jurisdiction. It wasn't part of their manicured little neighborhoods or their plastic-coated playgrounds. My deed proved it. But laughter turned into irritation when more letters followed. Unapproved modifications to fencing. Improper landscaping. Non-compliant exterior structures. Each one stacked in a pile on my kitchen counter, each one angrier than the last. I ignored them because I knew they held no power over me, or so I believed. But then came the fines. Then came the threats of legal action. And finally, the worst of all, Karen. She was the head of the HOA board, a woman with a jaw perpetually clenched and eyes that looked at everyone like they were beneath her. People in town called her the Queen because she strutted around as if the world owed her obedience. When she marched up my driveway one morning, clipboard in hand and sunglasses perched high on her nose, she demanded I submit to community regulations. I told her to leave. She said, "You'll regret this. We can make your life very difficult." Her words stuck with me longer than I wanted them to, but I refused to let someone like her dictate how I lived. I thought she'd give up. I thought wrong. That evening, sitting on my porch, Duke's ears perked up first. Headlights cut through the dark. Multiple vehicles, rolling down my driveway in a straight line. My gut twisted. I stood, my training already kicking in. This wasn't just a visit. This was a show of force. Out of the cars stepped police officers. 4 of them, their uniforms catching the faint glow of their headlights. They weren't here for casual conversation. They were tense, hesitant, like men ordered to walk into a situation they didn't believe in. Behind them in the back of one of the vehicles, I spotted Karen's silhouette. Of course she was here. The lead officer, tall with a mustache and weary eyes, approached first. His voice carried authority, but underneath it, discomfort. "Sir," he began, "we've been sent by the Homeowners Association. They claim this property is under seizure due to unpaid fees." My jaw tightened. "Unpaid fees?" I repeated slowly. "This isn't their property. This is my land. I bought it outright, and it's not under HOA control. I've got the deed to prove it." The officer sighed. "I understand, sir, but they filed paperwork with the county. They've asked us to enforce an order. If you don't cooperate, this could escalate." Duke growled low beside me, sensing my rising anger. I steadied him with a hand but didn't step back. My mind flashed through images from years overseas. Moments when authority figures claimed power they didn't rightfully hold. Moments when men with guns tried to intimidate villagers into submission. I had stood up to tyrants in foreign lands. Was I really about to let my own neighbors strip me of my rights? "No," I said firmly, my voice steady. "This land is mine. Federal deed, paid in full. They don't have the authority to touch it, and you know that." The officer hesitated. For a flicker of a moment, I saw respect in his eyes, like he knew I wasn't bluffing. But behind him, Karen rolled down her window and shouted, "Arrest him! He's trespassing on our land. He's dangerous. He has weapons." That was the line that lit the fire inside me. I had weapons, yes. Legal, registered, and secured. But she was twisting the truth, painting me as a threat to get her way. That's when I realized this wasn't about money. It wasn't about regulations. It was about power. Karen wanted to control me, and when she couldn't, she wanted me destroyed. I looked back at the officers. "You tell your bosses this," I said, my voice calm but sharp as steel. "I've defended this country against enemies overseas, and I'll defend this land the same way. I'm not breaking the law. They are, and if they want to fight, they'll get one." The silence hung thick in the air. Even the crickets had gone quiet. For a moment, no one moved. Finally, the officer lowered his hand from his belt and muttered, "We'll be back." They turned, retreating toward their vehicles. Karen screamed something about lawyers and lawsuits, but I didn't hear her clearly. My focus was on the horizon, where the headlights disappeared into the night. I knew then that this wasn't over. The HOA wasn't going to let it drop. Karen's pride wouldn't allow it. They would come back, more prepared, maybe with more legal tricks, maybe with more force. And so, as I stood there in the moonlight, Duke pressed against my leg. Something inside me hardened. I had faced battlefields before, but this one was personal. My land wasn't just soil and trees. It was the only piece of peace I had left. If they thought I'd surrender it, they didn't know me at all. That night I didn't sleep. Instead, I walked the perimeter of my property, my boots crunching on the gravel, scanning the tree line for weaknesses. Every instinct in me sharpened. This was no longer about letters or fines. This was war, and I was ready to fight it with every ounce of skill the Army had taught me. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of my property like I had done hundreds of times overseas, scanning for vulnerabilities. My land sat against the forest line, with open fields on one side and my cabin tucked near the trees. Perfect terrain for defense. I knew they would come back, stronger and more prepared. Karen wasn't the type to let her ego lose. She had probably already called the HOA board, stirring up lies and threats. And when they came, they wouldn't just bring papers, they'd bring muscle. I started building. Using old lumber, cinder blocks, and even scrap metal from my barn, I fortified the driveway with barricades. I set up cameras linked to my laptop so I could monitor every angle of approach. My training wasn't just combat, it was survival. I laid down motion sensors along the fence line, crafted tripwires with cans that rattled at the slightest disturbance, and even dug shallow trenches disguised under leaves. My property became more than land. It became a fortress. Duke followed me every step, his ears alert as if he knew we were preparing for war. At night, I barely slept. I sat by the window, shotgun across my lap, watching shadows move across the tree line. I thought about the absurdity of it all. Neighbors of all people, trying to take a veteran's land. But it wasn't just about property anymore. It was about principle. They wanted to make an example of me, to show the community that no one could stand against them. What they didn't know was that I had faced far worse enemies than a power-drunk HOA. The second arrival came on a Saturday. This time, more squad cars, HOA, board members in suits, and Karen herself in sunglasses, strutting like she owned the world. The officers demanded access again. Karen smirked from behind them, already picturing my land as hers. But when they reached my barricades, they realized this wasn't going to be easy. "Sir, this looks like a military setup," one cop muttered. "That's because it is," I said, stepping out with calm authority. My voice carried the weight of a man who had commanded soldiers in the field. "This land is mine, and you'll have to get through me to take it." The silence was heavy. For the first time, Karen's smirk faltered. The standoff stretched for hours. The HOA argued, the cops whispered to each other, and I stood my ground. I wasn't breaking any laws. My deed was ironclad, my rights unshakable. Eventually, one of the younger officers walked up to me privately. "Sir, off the record," he said, lowering his voice. "We all know this is nonsense. We're here because she's politically connected, but no one wants to cross you. If you hold firm, this will collapse." His words lit a spark of hope. Karen, however, was relentless. She screamed about community standards and shared property rights, her voice shrill as she demanded I be arrested. But the cops didn't move. They had seen enough. They weren't going to escalate against a decorated veteran who had broken no laws. Frustrated, Karen called her lawyer, pacing and waving her hands like she was the general of some army. I almost laughed. She had no idea what a real battlefield looked like,